Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I stood across the street that night, watching the soft amber lights flicker to life one by one behind the wide windows of the Cedar Lane event hall, the same place where I had once imagined walking in arm with Jason, wearing a dress I had picked out weeks in advance, greeted by family, friends, music, laughter, the start of something that finally felt like mine. From the outside, the venue looked warm and inviting, with neatly trimmed hedges, glowing lanterns lining the walkway, and faint classical music already drifting out through the glass doors. I stood still in the dark, coat buttoned up to my chin, my breath curling in the cold evening air, thinking about how just 1 week earlier, my parents told me it was all too expensive. I remember exactly how they said it, too. My mother's voice had that familiar tone of forced regret, that thin layer of concern stretched over something colder beneath. "Claire, sweetheart," she'd started over the phone, pausing for dramatic effect like she always did when she was about to disappoint me and wanted to soften the blow with fake softness. "Your father and I looked at the final cost of the engagement party, and we think it's just a bit much. We were hoping to downsize. Something simpler, maybe in the backyard or the community center." I didn't say anything for a moment. I just stared at my laptop screen, where I had the venue's confirmation email still open, with the guest list, the catering details, the deposit already paid. Jason had just stepped out to grab us lunch, and I could still hear the distant hum of his car pulling away. I swallowed the lump that started to rise in my throat and said, "You told me it was fine. You told me you wanted to celebrate this properly." And then came the part that stung even more, the part where they didn't even pretend to be apologetic. "We still do, honey," my father said, cutting in like he couldn't be bothered to let my mother handle the full weight of disappointment on her own. "But there's a lot going on financially right now, and it just doesn't make sense to spend that kind of money for a party. We're sure you understand." That sentence, "we're sure you understand," was like a goddamn punch in the ribs disguised as a compliment. They always assumed I'd be the one to understand, to accommodate, to compromise. I'd spent most of my adult life being the one who didn't ask for too much, who didn't rock the boat, who nodded politely while everyone else got to shine. I ended that call with a quiet, "Okay," even though I wanted to scream. I walked into the kitchen and told Jason they canceled the party, and I did it with a smile so forced my cheeks hurt. He looked surprised, disappointed, of course, but he didn't push me. He just said, "We'll find another way. It'll still be special." I remember hugging him and trying not to cry, not because I cared so much about the party itself, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that my joy was always treated like an inconvenience, something that needed to be trimmed, edited, toned down to fit their expectations. I started to wonder if that's what it meant to be part of this family, learning how to shrink your happiness so it didn't outshine the people they actually wanted to celebrate. And maybe that's the part that hurts most. Not the cancellation, not the money, not the change in plans. It was realizing that I still had this little voice in my head hoping that one day they'd look at me and say, "You deserve this." But they never did. Not once. I kept showing up, kept earning, kept proving, and somehow it was never quite enough. Not for them. Have you ever been treated like your joy was a burden while someone else got praised just for showing up? Have you ever felt like you were doing everything right but still got handed scraps while someone else got the whole damn cake? Drop your story in the comments, because if you've been there, you already know how deep that cut goes. It wasn't until 3 days later that the real gut punch landed. I got a text from my younger sister Samantha, an invitation complete with digital calligraphy and an RSVP link. "Join us to celebrate Samantha's 30th birthday," it read, followed by the event details. I clicked the link, scrolling through the photos of the venue, the menu, the custom cocktail list. Cedar Lane Event Hall. Same place. Same date block. Same catering company. Same floral designer I had picked out months ago. And suddenly, everything made sense in the ugliest, clearest way. The party wasn't too expensive. It just wasn't too expensive for her. I wish I could say that the moment I saw the invitation to Samantha's birthday party shocked me, but the truth is, it didn't. Not really. It was more like a confirmation of something I'd known all my life, but had never fully said out loud, even to myself. It was like someone had taken every quiet suspicion, every subtle sting, every glance passed over at the dinner table, and finally put it into words, printed it in cursive, and sent it straight to my phone. All the carefully balanced excuses I used to protect myself, the ones that whispered maybe I was overreacting, maybe I was just being too sensitive, maybe I hadn't earned more, collapsed under the weight of that invitation. And I knew, with a kind of bitter clarity, that this wasn't new. This was just the latest version of something I'd been living since childhood. Samantha always got the bigger piece. That's how I've started telling it to myself in the simplest terms possible. She got the bigger slice of cake, the louder applause, the warmer hugs, the easier forgiveness. It started young. I remember birthdays where I'd unwrap a thoughtful sweater or a single book while she tore through pile after pile of glittery gift bags, each one filled with shiny distractions and overpriced makeup sets she'd break or lose within days. I remember her parties with bounce houses, balloon arches, ice cream bars, and professional photographers, while mine were modest gatherings at home with finger food and a cake from the grocery store bakery. Our parents never called it favoritism. They called it fitting the occasion. They called it Samantha loves a crowd, and you've always preferred something quieter. I remember the time I brought home a perfect report card, straight A's, 3 honor distinctions, and a teacher's note about my leadership in class, and my mother smiled vaguely and said, "That's great, Claire. You've always been the studious one." But when Samantha passed her summer school math class with a C-, they threw a dinner party. I sat through that meal while they toasted her perseverance and turning a corner, like she'd just won a national award for barely scraping by. My father even said, "Sometimes the small victories are the most meaningful." I wanted to scream, but instead, I just folded my napkin and nodded. There was always a reason, always a justification for why she got more, even when she did less. She's more outgoing. She's still finding herself. She's got a softer heart than you. My personal favorite was the one they used the most often, the one that stuck to my ribs like cold oatmeal. "You're stronger, Claire. She just needs a little more help." That one sentence followed me into adulthood like a shadow, like a debt I didn't remember agreeing to pay, but somehow ended up responsible for anyway. I vented to Erica about it more times than I can count. She was my best friend since college, the kind of woman who didn't sugarcoat anything, who saw through people faster than I ever could, and who never let me wallow without also pushing me toward the truth. We were sitting in her living room 2 days after I got the invitation, the unopened envelope sitting on her coffee table while we drank wine straight from the bottle like we were still in our 20s. "You know what this is," she said, holding the envelope like it was a dead rat. "They just didn't want to spend that kind of money on you because they don't think you're the one worth showcasing. You're the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who doesn't need anything, remember." "I'm also the one who pays half their medical bills," I replied bitterly, my voice sharper than I intended. "But I guess that's not worth a fancy venue." She looked at me over the rim of her glass and said, "You've been carrying this family for years, and they've got you so twisted up, you still think you need to earn their approval." And I hated how right she was. I hated that after all these years, after all the responsibilities I'd quietly taken on, I still felt like a kid trying to be seen, trying to be enough. But nothing snapped the thread quite like what I heard that weekend at my parents' house. I'd stopped by to drop off a check for my dad's physical therapy, something I did every month without being asked, without being thanked, and as I walked past the living room, I heard my mother's voice from the hallway. She was talking to Samantha, who had apparently dropped in for one of her casual visits that always ended with our parents fawning over her like she was royalty gracing them with her presence. "We just want you to have the celebration you deserve," my mother said, her voice full of warmth I hadn't heard in years. And in that exact moment, I stopped walking. I stood there in the hallway, holding the envelope in my hand, my heart pounding in my ears, and I realized something shifted in me that I couldn't take back. Because if this was what Samantha deserved, if this lavish event, this stage, this attention, this money, this space, was something she had earned by simply existing, then what the hell did that make me? Whatever it was, I decided right then and there that it was time to stop playing the part they'd written for me. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't come with shouting or slammed doors or explosive arguments. It's the quiet kind, the kind that slides in under your skin and settles there, invisible but heavy, dragging down every part of you with its weight. That's exactly the kind of pain I felt the moment I sat across from my parents and realized they had never truly respected the man I was going to marry. Not because he had done anything wrong, not because he had ever been anything less than kind, steady, and endlessly supportive, but because he didn't wear the kind of success they could show off like a designer label. That was the moment I stopped trying to explain myself to people who only measured worth by the number of zeros on a paycheck or the brand of a wristwatch. It started the day I really asked them, why my engagement party had been quietly erased while my sister's birthday bash was being planned like a royal coronation. I didn't come in swinging. I didn't come in bitter or angry or accusatory. I came in with the kind of restrained grace I had spent years perfecting, the kind that keeps the peace even while your voice trembles beneath the surface. I sat down across the kitchen table from them, my fingers interlocked, heart pounding, trying to give them the benefit of the doubt one last time. Was it really about the cost? I asked, keeping my tone even. Because I saw the numbers. The venue, the menu, the entertainment, it's the exact same package I chose for my engagement party. So what changed? They exchanged one of those glances that parents think their kids don't notice, the kind that says more than words ever could. My mother spoke first, her voice soft, almost pitying, like she was trying to cushion the blow of what she knew she was about to say. Claire, we just didn't feel like it was the right moment to make such a grand display for you and Jason. I leaned in slightly, already knowing there was more. My father followed, clearing his throat like he always did before delivering bad news disguised as wisdom. It's not that we don't want to celebrate you, he said, as if that would make what came next hurt any less. But if we're being honest, your fiancé, he's not one of us. And there it was. The truth, dropped like a stone in the middle of a pond, sending ripples through everything I'd tried so hard to believe about this family. I sat there, trying to keep my hands steady, trying not to let my face betray the heat rising up from my chest. What do you mean, not one of us? I asked, even though I already knew exactly what they meant. My mother sighed. Reaching for her tea like this was a conversation about fabric swatches and not my entire life. Claire, love is lovely, of course it is. But a strong future, a secure future, it's about more than just affection. Jason's a good man, but he's a school teacher. He's always going to have limits, financially, socially. We just think you could do better, someone with ambition, someone who fits into the circles we move in. I could feel my fingernails digging into my palm beneath the table. I remembered the first time I brought Jason home to meet them, how polite they were, how they smiled and asked questions, but with that undercurrent of disinterest that never quite faded. I remembered how my father asked him if he had ever thought about getting a real leadership position, and how my mother had whispered to me afterward that he seems sweet, but he's a little plain. What they didn't see, or didn't care to see, was how Jason never missed a chance to ask how my day went, how he made me feel safe without making me small, how he remembered the names of my coworkers and always showed up with a hand on my back, steadying me in ways no one else ever had. They didn't see the man who held me when I cried, who cooked for me when I worked late, who never once made me feel like I had to apologize for being strong or successful or tired or vulnerable. They just saw his shoes weren't expensive and his job didn't come with a title they could brag about at dinner parties. And so there it was, laid bare on the table between us, the reason my celebration was quietly swept aside, the reason they poured time and money into my sister's birthday while telling me to keep things simple. It wasn't about budgets or logistics or timing. It was about shame. It was about the fact that I'd chosen love over status, partnership over performance, a man with a heart instead of a pedigree. And in their eyes, that made me the one who needed to be quietly sidelined. I pushed my chair back slowly, rising to my feet, my pulse roaring in my ears. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just looked at them both, really looked at them, and said, "You'll regret underestimating him. And you'll regret underestimating me." Then I walked out of their house, out of the kitchen that had raised me, out of the roles they had cast me in since I was old enough to tie my shoes. But I didn't leave empty-handed. I left with a plan. And for once in my life, I wasn't going to explain it. I was just going to let them feel it. There's a kind of power in silence that most people overlook, a kind of quiet that can wrap itself around a room and change the air without a single word being spoken, and that was the exact kind of energy I carried with me the night of Samantha's birthday party. I had never planned on attending, not after everything that had unfolded, not after the sickly sweet way my parents dismissed my engagement and reduced my relationship to something they could scoff at in private conversations and brush aside with rehearsed pity. But sometimes, showing up isn't about participating. It's about watching the collapse you've already set in motion and letting everyone believe, for just a few moments longer, that nothing is wrong. Jason and I pulled up to the venue just before the first wave of guests started arriving, and as we stepped out of the car, I remember thinking how strange it was that this place, this expensive, polished, over-decorated venue, had once been pitched to me as too much, as unnecessary, as not practical for a simple engagement party. Yet here it stood, decked out with crystal centerpieces, silk table runners, a live string quartet near the fountain, and gold-accented everything as far as the eye could see. A party that screamed status, that was built to impress and flaunt, all for a woman whose greatest accomplishments to date were curating an Instagram aesthetic and choosing the right filter for her selfies. I wore a dress that turned heads, but spoke elegance instead of arrogance, a deep navy silk with a high neckline and subtle drape, understated jewelry, and hair pulled back in a way that made people look twice, but never question the intention. Jason looked just as sharp, tailored suit, calm presence, eyes scanning everything without needing to say a word. He knew something was coming, even if he didn't know the full extent of it, and he trusted me enough not to ask. He just stood beside me, offering that same quiet support he always had, the kind that never demanded a spotlight but made you feel like there was one behind you anyway. We entered the party with smiles, nodding politely at guests we recognized from various family events over the years, neighbors, colleagues, old acquaintances, the kind of people who said things like, "You look wonderful," while secretly measuring your worth in whispers and glances. I played the part they expected, warm enough to seem gracious, distant enough to remind them I wasn't there to beg for anyone's approval. And no one suspected a thing. I made my way through the room like a well-rehearsed diplomat, exchanging pleasantries, sipping from a champagne flute and keeping my eyes on the timing. Samantha floated through the space like royalty, draped in a floor-length sequin gown that shimmered with every step, laughing too loudly, hugging too tightly. Smiling a little too wide for someone who had never worked for anything but still acted like she had conquered the world. She barely acknowledged my presence beyond a polite air kiss and a comment about how glad she was that I'd finally decided to show up. I smiled, nodded, and moved along. It was halfway through the evening, just after the second round of cocktails had been served and the speeches were being prepared, that I quietly stepped aside, slipped my phone from my clutch, and sent the email I had drafted days before but kept tucked in my drafts until the perfect moment. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't theatrical, just a clean message with one instruction: initiate delivery. I hit send, slipped my phone back into my bag, and returned to the crowd just in time to catch my mother raving to a group of guests about how proud they were of Samantha's growth and how far she's come. 10 minutes later, the delivery man entered the venue through the side hallway, dressed in a black uniform with a small envelope in his hand and an expression that said he was just doing his job. He walked directly to my father, bypassing every server and guest like he had memorized the layout, and handed him the envelope with a simple "delivery for Robert Jensen." My father took it with a polite nod, glancing at it with mild confusion, and I could already see the first flicker of unease cross his face before he even opened it. It didn't take long. As he pulled the papers from the envelope and began reading, the color drained from his face in slow degrees, like someone had turned a dimmer switch on his confidence. His hand stiffened around the edges of the document, his jaw clenched tighter, and he looked up toward my mother with eyes that weren't just confused, they were afraid. My mother, sensing the shift in energy, crossed the room to him with concern blooming on her face, and that's when the whispering started, small at first, then growing, because tension spreads fast in a room built on appearances. I watched them from across the room, standing near the bar, sipping my drink with the calm detachment of someone who had finally stopped waiting to be chosen and started writing her own narrative. Jason stood beside me, his eyes darting between me and the unfolding chaos, and I could feel the question building in his throat, even as he stayed quiet. Then I made my way toward them, slowly, deliberately, like every step was a quiet drumbeat counting down to the truth they had buried under years of favoritism and manipulation. I stopped in front of my mother, leaned in just close enough so that only she could hear, and said with a smile so small it almost looked kind, "Check the deed. I hope Samantha loves renting." Her eyes widened, lips parting to speak, but no sound came out. And for the first time in my life, I watched her realize that I wasn't the one who needed their approval anymore. I was the one who finally understood the cost of staying silent, and I had just handed them the bill. The beauty of a well-executed plan isn't in its loudness or its spectacle, it's in the quiet precision, the way every moving part clicks into place without needing to shout, the way people don't even realize what's happening until it's far too late to stop it. That party, that uncomfortable silence that settled into the air after I whispered to my mother about the deed, was never just an impulsive stunt. It was a chapter in a story I had been writing for months, long before any venue cancellation or cruel remark about my fiancé. It was the payoff to a strategy crafted in silence, built with care, and rooted in a truth I had carried with me for years. If I was always going to be the one they underestimated, then I would make that their biggest mistake. What no one in my family knew, what no one even thought to ask, was that I had quietly received a sizable inheritance about a year before this entire mess unfolded. It came from my grandmother, my father's mother, a woman who had always seen more in me than anyone else ever did, even if she rarely said it out loud. She passed quietly, and when the will was read, it shocked everyone to learn that I had been left a significant portion of her estate, far more than anyone anticipated. Especially since everyone assumed most of it would go to my parents or be split evenly between Samantha and me. My parents didn't ask questions when I told them I'd set most of it aside, and they assumed, because they always assumed, that I'd done something noble and boring with it, like donating it to charity or investing in a low-yield mutual fund. They never considered that I might use it to build something entirely my own, something they couldn't touch, control, or manipulate. And I certainly never corrected them. I let them believe whatever made them comfortable while I made moves in silence. What I did instead was simple on paper but devastating in effect. I found out, almost by accident, that the Cedar Lane Event Hall was owned by a small hospitality holding company that was quietly struggling, nothing public, nothing dramatic. Just a slow bleed of debt and mismanagement that had gone unnoticed by anyone who didn't know how to read financial statements with the right kind of suspicion. I made an offer through a third-party entity, discreet and legal, with enough leverage to take full control of not just the event hall, but the company's underlying assets, commercial land, secondary venues, and most importantly, the adjoining plots tied to trust-managed residential properties, one of which happened to be the same land parcel where my parents had built Samantha's gifted house several years ago. Turns out that parcel was never fully purchased. It had been leased through a trust structure, with my father acting as co-beneficiary and a guarantor clause written into the trust agreement in my name. At the time, I didn't think much of it, just another family favor they assumed I'd sign without protest. But now, with full control over the holding company that technically owned the land, I found myself holding a set of keys they didn't even remember handing me. So I used them. First, I rerouted the payment channels supporting the lease on the land beneath Samantha's home, using my position as majority stakeholder to freeze the trust's access. Then I submitted a formal notification to the management office that oversight would be changing. I didn't evict her, didn't threaten legal action, didn't so much as raise my voice. I just severed the ties, quietly and cleanly, turning her mansion into a liability with a ticking clock. If they wanted to continue occupancy, they'd have to renegotiate terms I would write. Everything I did was legal. Everything I did was airtight. The kind of meticulous documentation that couldn't be undone with a phone call or a teary-eyed plea. And most importantly, every document carried my name now, not theirs. Not Samantha's. Mine. When the party ended in a fog of whispers and confusion, my parents approached me privately near the entrance, their expressions tight with barely contained panic. My father held the papers in his hand, already rumpled from hours of frantic reading and rereading, while my mother clutched her pearls like she was trying to hold on to the last shred of control she thought she had. "You didn't have to go this far," my father said, his voice low but sharp. "Whatever point you think you've made," my mother added, her voice trembling, "it's cruel. Samantha doesn't deserve this." I looked at them both, calm and unshaken, feeling more grounded than I had in years. "Maybe next time," I said, voice even and deliberate, "pick love over appearances." And then I walked away again, not with rage, not with pride, but with something far deeper certainty. Because I had learned something they hadn't. Power doesn't come from shouting louder or pleasing more. Power comes from knowing exactly where your value lies and refusing to let anyone else define it for you. That night, long after the party had disintegrated into awkward goodbyes and confused whispers, after the lights at the venue were dimmed and the catering staff quietly packed away the remnants of an event no one would forget for all the wrong reasons, I sat on the back porch with Jason, wrapped in a soft blanket and cradling a mug of lukewarm tea, staring into the darkness like it could offer some kind of answer I hadn't already found. The cool night air settled heavy around us, not uncomfortable but thick with everything that hadn't been said during the storm that I had orchestrated with the careful hands of a woman who was done pretending she didn't know her worth. He hadn't asked me a single question until we got home, hadn't pushed or prodded or demanded explanations. He just stood by my side through every moment, through the tense glances, the whispered speculation, the sharp intake of breath when my father unfolded the documents, and the look of pure devastation that flickered across my mother's face when she realized the world she had built on appearances was now slipping through her fingers. But now, sitting in the quiet of our backyard, Jason finally turned to me with that look in his eyes, not fear, not disapproval, not even shock, but a kind of curious disbelief that made my heart ache more than anything my family had said. "So," he said slowly, carefully, "you're going to have to tell me exactly how you managed to pull all of that off." I let out a quiet laugh, not bitter, just tired. "It's a long story," I said, curling my fingers tighter around the mug. "And most of it started long before we even met." And so I told him everything about the inheritance I never mentioned because I didn't want money to be another line in our relationship ledger, about the holding company I purchased in silence, about the clauses and the loopholes and the signature buried in the trust agreement that gave me leverage I never thought I'd use. I told him about how I spent months researching, drafting, watching, waiting, building something not out of revenge but out of necessity, because I finally realized that if I didn't protect my own peace, no one else was going to do it for me. Jason listened quietly, nodding occasionally, his eyes never leaving mine. And when I finally stopped speaking, when the words had all spilled out into the night air and the weight of them settled between us, he just shook his head and said, "I'm not surprised you could do it. I'm just surprised it took this long for you to stop letting them walk all over you." It wasn't judgment. It was truth. And it hit me harder than I expected. The next morning, I met Erica at our usual brunch spot, a little hole-in-the-wall diner that served coffee strong enough to cut through any hangover, emotional or otherwise. She slid into the booth across from me, raised one eyebrow, and said, "Well, that was a hell of a party." I smirked, stirring cream into my cup. "You think I went too far?" She tilted her head, thought for a moment, then shook it. "No. I think you went just far enough. You didn't just take back a house. You took back your damn self." That sentence stayed with me all day, echoing in my head like a quiet anthem I hadn't realized I needed to hear. Because that's what it really was, not just a legal maneuver, not just a show of power or a clever sting operation against a family that never knew how to treat me right. It was reclamation. Of space. Of dignity. Of peace. In the days that followed, the fallout arrived like clockwork. My parents called repeatedly, voicemails filled with feigned confusion, wounded tones, desperate requests to talk things through. My mother sent long, dramatic texts about how families should stick together and how she just wanted us to be close again. My father tried the business route, logical arguments, pleas for compromise, explanations of the greater good. And then, of course, there was Samantha. She sent message after message, each one a little more unhinged than the last. First confusion, then anger, then guilt, then full-blown begging. She said she didn't know what was going on, that it wasn't fair, that I was punishing her for something she didn't even understand. She asked what I wanted, how she could fix it, how I could possibly do something so heartless over a party. I didn't respond to any of it. Not right away. Until one evening, when the text started to feel more like noise than anything meaningful, I sent one message back. Short, direct, deliberate. Tell Mom and Dad they can keep the house. All I want is a public apology to Jason. Not to me. To him. In front of every guest they tried to impress at that party. I never said what would happen if they didn't follow through. I didn't need to. That was the beauty of leverage. It speaks loudest in silence. And deep down, I already knew the truth. They would never do it. Not because they couldn't, but because it would mean acknowledging what they had tried so hard to deny, that the man I chose, the life I chose, the woman I became without their approval, was worth more than their standards ever could measure. I didn't want their apology. I didn't need their redemption. I just wanted them to sit in the discomfort they had created, to stew in the same silence they once forced me into every time they chose image over love, status over sincerity. And that's the thing about value, it doesn't come from how loudly people praise you, or how much they spend on a party in your honor. It comes from knowing your own worth and refusing to sell it to people who only want to rent your dignity when it suits them. Funny how they finally saw my value when I stopped asking them to recognize it.